They weren't looking for gold. They weren't looking for glory. 9 knights stood on the ancient dust of Jerusalem in 1119 and demanded of all places to live atop the ruins of Solomon's temple. No towers, no moat, just crumbling stones and buried silence. Then they began to dig. For 9 years, no one was allowed inside. No one saw what they unearthed. But when they emerged, they weren't the same. Neither was history. Because what they found down there, if you believe the whispers, wasn't just ancient. It was prophetic. You won't find this in your textbooks. No classroom would dare. So let's slow down now and look deeper beneath the ruins, beneath the records, beneath the centuries of noise until we find the one story history couldn't erase, only bury. It starts like all great mysteries with a strange request. The newly formed Knights Templar, fresh from battle and barely known, arrive in the Holy Land and ask King Baldwin II for residence. But not just any residence, they ask for the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, the spot long believed to be the very foundations of Solomon's temple. Most historians blink past this detail. But if you linger, if you let your eyes adjust to the dark, the questions begin to flicker. Why would 9 battle-hardened knights choose ruins over ramparts? Why for nearly a decade did no new recruits join them? Why did their wealth and their secrets explode immediately afterward? And what did they leave behind? Because when the order fell centuries later, there were no scrolls, no treasure, no artifacts left to seize, only rumors of tunnels, of rituals, of a prophecy carved in stone and sealed away. Tonight we're not chasing myths, we're tracing footsteps through bloodied crusades and forgotten catacombs, through the cathedrals of Europe and the silence of underground chambers, through centuries of erasure. Because if the Templars really did discover a prophecy beneath Solomon's temple, then every king, pope, and secret society that followed was playing from their script. So light a candle. Keep watch over the eastern wall. And before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The streets of Jerusalem were still breathing smoke when they arrived. 9 men, weary but resolute, their armor dulled by sand and time. No grand fanfare heralded their entrance. No clergy lined the roads with blessings. They entered the city like shadows and asked for something even stranger than their silence. They didn't request a stronghold. Not a fortress along the walls, nor a palace tucked safely within Christian quarters. Instead, these self-proclaimed guardians of pilgrims asked for lodging in the ruins of Solomon's temple. King Baldwin II, perhaps intrigued or simply amused, granted them quarters in the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as it had been known under Muslim rule. It was an unusual choice, even by Crusader standards. To modern eyes, it seems nonsensical. Why would battle-trained knights choose the crumbling foundations of a desecrated monument over defensible walls? But they weren't looking for high ground. They were looking for something beneath it. For nearly a decade, those 9 knights lived there, and there is no reliable account of what they did. The chronicler William of Tyre, writing decades later, portrayed them as humble protectors of pilgrims guarding the roads to the Jordan. But he admits they had no notable activity, no recorded battles, no political intrigue, no recruitment. Just 9 men huddled on sacred ruins year after year. It sounds more like a monastic vigil than a military outpost. Or perhaps an excavation. One of the few contemporary letters from that time, a diplomatic correspondence between the Patriarch of Jerusalem and a monastic scribe in Constantinople, makes a passing mention of knights keeping vigil beneath the mount, as though awaiting a sign. A poetic phrase, perhaps, or a veiled reference to activity the church didn't fully endorse. Years later, after the Templars had grown into a wealthy, sprawling power, legends began to swirl. That during those silent years in Jerusalem, they were digging. That their residence atop the Temple Mount was no accident. That beneath the rubble of Solomon's temple, they believed something was hidden, not a relic, but a revelation. One well-known theory often dismissed by academic historians, but impossible to disprove outright, is that these first Templars had acquired a fragment of an earlier map. A crusader's sketch, or perhaps even a translated scroll, brought west by an earlier pilgrim. Something that pointed to chambers buried beneath the Mount Chambers that predated the Second Temple, possibly even Solomon's own sanctuary. If such a document existed, it would explain the urgency and secrecy of their request. Of course, the historical fact remains the Al-Aqsa compound had been largely neglected since the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in 638. It was not actively maintained during most of the Islamic period, and the Christian rulers of Jerusalem had little use for it beyond symbolic control. To the Templars, this presented opportunity. A location with religious gravitas, a central position within the Holy City, and crucially, no competition for its use. They would not be disturbed. What's even more curious is that after these 9 years, the Templar order suddenly transformed. Recruits flooded in. Donations poured from royal houses. The church itself endorsed them with a special council convened by Bernard of Clairvaux. It's almost as if someone or something validated their hidden efforts. There's an obscure but tantalizing record from a French monastery in Champagne that claims one of the original 9 knights returned to Europe with proof of divine direction. The document is ambiguous, but if taken at face value, it suggests they didn't just find something, they found instructions. And that changes everything. Because if those years were not just a vigil, but a decoding. If their mission was not invented in the rubble of Jerusalem, but confirmed there, then the entire arc of Templar history, from their sudden rise to their violent fall, bends around that moment. You may remember earlier we glimpsed the strange absence of treasure when the Templars were finally dissolved. The chroniclers were baffled. Where were the relics? The scrolls, the sacred trophies? Perhaps they were never hoarded. Perhaps they were buried again, far from prying eyes. But that would imply something deeper, that the Templars believed what they found should remain sealed. Or worse, that they feared it might one day be unsealed. One scholar, the late Etienne Alcuin, argued that the Templar silence in their early years was ritual, that they weren't excavating but preparing, that beneath the Temple Mount they performed rites meant not to uncover but to awaken. His thesis, largely ignored outside French esoteric circles, claims they followed an encoded liturgy derived from earlier Judeo-Christian apocalyptic texts. Absurd, perhaps. But remember, the silence is real. The location is real. The request to live atop the ancient stones is real. And the transformation that followed was unlike anything in medieval Europe. You can laugh off mysticism. You can roll your eyes at prophecy. But 9 men with swords did not squat on a holy ruin for 9 years just to say their prayers. They were waiting, or digging, or decoding. And if the whispers are right, they may have found something that didn't want to be found. The Temple Mount, revered by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, is more than sacred ground. It is a labyrinth of secrets sealed beneath centuries of stone and silence. When the newly formed Templars took up residence atop its remains in 1119, most assumed they were stationed there for symbolic reasons. A tribute to Solomon, a badge of religious honor. But whispers that began not long after suggested something far more deliberate and far more unsettling. Multiple medieval sources hint in frustratingly cryptic fashion that the Templars didn't simply live on the Temple Mount they dug. A letter preserved in the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés mentions operations conducted beneath the house of the Lord, and cautions that, should they be discovered, the Brotherhood would forfeit divine favor. Another account from a Cistercian chronicler writing in 1145 refers to the brethren laboring in the foundations and extracting the wisdom entombed there. These aren't idle phrases. In an age when words were parchment gold, they mean something. And what they imply is excavation, tunneling, a mission undertaken with care and secrecy, possibly without even the full knowledge of the Church. Fast forward to the late 19th century, when British engineer and archaeologist Charles Warren conducted one of the first modern surveys of the Temple Mount. In narrow shafts and ancient water channels, Warren discovered evidence of Crusader-era diggings, tools, burn marks, reinforcement beams placed where no Islamic or Jewish records noted construction. It was as though someone had been crawling through the mountain's bones carefully, purposefully. Warren's logs are filled with frustration. Many passages had caved in. Others had been deliberately sealed. He even records local workers refusing to enter certain tunnels, citing old legends about watchers beneath the earth. And although Warren never explicitly accused the Templars, he noted with the faintest Victorian sarcasm that one must consider the possibility that our Christian predecessors were quite fond of subterranean adventure. Later archaeological investigations, though limited by religious and political sensitivities, confirmed his findings. There are passages beneath the mount that serve no apparent architectural function. They're too narrow for water channels, too hidden for maintenance. They twist and descend not toward utility, but toward intention. It's like stumbling upon a staircase carved by faith and fear in equal measure. If the Templars were responsible, as many now believe, then the next question is obvious. What were they looking for? Some say the Ark of the Covenant. Others suggest ancient scrolls, perhaps from a forgotten pre-exilic priesthood. But there's a third theory, less glamorous yet far more provocative, that they sought not a relic, but a record. A prophecy etched in stone or ink, which had lain dormant beneath the city since Solomon's reign. This theory gained traction after the discovery of a curious artifact in the Vatican archives in 1989, a map drawn by a Crusader hand showing a schematic of the Temple Mount with strange annotations. One chamber is labeled Domus Viae, the House of the Way. Another is marked only with a symbol, an open eye within a triangle. Historians have debated its meaning for decades, but several believe this was a Templar attempt to catalog the underground, a treasure map of ideas, not gold. And here's where things tilt further into the strange. Around the same time that those 9 knights took residence, multiple Jewish texts, particularly from the Karaite tradition, begin referencing increased interest in the foundation beneath the mountain. One rabbi in Cairo writes of Christians in Jerusalem moving the dust of our fathers, while another warns of a search that cannot end in light. These aren't coincidences. They are echoes, and they suggest that whatever the Templars were doing, others were watching, perhaps even warning. A small but fascinating counterpoint arises from Islamic sources. A 12th century Syrian chronicle mentions rumors of Frankish soldiers violating sacred ground and implies that the damage done beneath Al-Aqsa caused local earthquakes, a poetic way perhaps of describing spiritual upheaval. Whether literal or metaphorical, it again supports the idea that the Templars weren't simply squatting, they were interfering. But here's the real twist: after their 9 years atop the Temple Mount, they left. Voluntarily, without fanfare. And within a decade, their order had mushroomed into the most powerful military religious institution in Europe, as if something had been unlocked. There's a strange detail in a Burgundian document from the 1130s. It records a knight, possibly an early Templar, confessing under duress that he had seen a stone that breathed. The phrase is often dismissed as metaphor or hallucination, but to those who study the intersection of esoteric theology and sacred geometry, the living stone has deep resonance. In some traditions, it represents hidden knowledge made animate, a prophecy with pulse. It's a stretch, sure. But even skeptics admit the timing is suspicious. 9 obscure knights enter Jerusalem. They dig beneath the temple. They vanish from public record. And when they reappear, the world has changed. It's easy to dismiss stories like this. Medieval sources are full of exaggeration. But facts, when you pile them up carefully, like old stones in a forgotten tunnel, begin to form shapes. And that shape in this case looks a lot like a staircase, leading down. It's easy to forget, in the soft glow of medieval romance, that the Temple Mount wasn't just a symbol, it was contested ground. To Jews, it was the site of the first and second temples, the divine meeting place between heaven and earth. To Muslims, it housed the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, from which the Prophet Muhammad was said to have ascended into the heavens. And to Christians, well, it was complicated. Revered, yes, but also feared, tangled in prophecy blood and centuries of silence. And yet the Templars chose to plant themselves right in the middle of it. They didn't merely set up shop near the Temple Mount. They moved into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a building which to their contemporaries was clearly Islamic. The Crusaders even called it Templum Salomonis, the Temple of Solomon, despite knowing full well it was a repurposed mosque. That deliberate renaming has raised eyebrows for centuries. Was it propaganda or a signal to those who understood that the building's name didn't matter, that what lay beneath it was the real prize? Historically, it's a fact that the Templars were granted use of the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Baldwin II. It became their headquarters for nearly 70 years. But what's rarely mentioned is how obsessive they were about maintaining it even as better fortresses became available in the city. Even when the tides of war made the location a liability, they held on to it. Not out of convenience, out of necessity. There are clues hidden in plain sight. One of the earliest Templar seals features 2 knights riding a single horse, often interpreted as a symbol of poverty. But another theory posits that it reflects a dual mission, the outer visible life of soldier monks and the inner secret work conducted beneath the Temple Mount. 2 riders, 2 purposes. Adding to the intrigue is a small architectural anomaly in the mosque itself, a lower chamber beneath the eastern wall inaccessible to the public and unremarkable to most archaeologists. But in 1992, an Israeli team surveying historical earthquake damage noted that the chamber bore Crusader-era reinforcement beams oddly placed and carved with unfamiliar geometric marks. One beam in particular features a symbol strikingly similar to the Chi-Rho, the early Christian Christogram, but flanked by mirrored crescents. A blending of religious iconography, or a code meant only for initiates. It's not just structural anomalies that raise questions. The Templars kept detailed inventories of their holdings across Europe: grain stores, livestock, even candle quantities. But for Al-Aqsa, nothing. No records survive of what they stored there, built there, or moved through its halls. It's a blackout, a gap in an otherwise obsessive bureaucracy. A curious theory surfaced in the 20th century from Spanish historian Diego Meneses, who suggested that Al-Aqsa served as the entry point to an inner sanctum, a chamber the Templars believed predated all 3 Abrahamic religions. Meneses, hardly a fringe thinker, argued that the mosque had been chosen not for its surface sanctity, but for its alignment with celestial bodies, solstice markers, and subterranean lines of force. In his view, the building was a kind of capstone ceiling in an older buried structure, a structure the Templars intended to awaken. Skeptical, fair enough. But the Templars' own rituals offer a strange echo. While most Christian orders held their initiations in chapels or open-air spaces, Templar ceremonies were conducted in closed, candlelit rooms. Silent, symbolic, often underground. One 13th-century Inquisition record refers to a novice who panicked during initiation, claiming he'd been brought beneath the dome where the sky had once wept fire. Hyperbole, maybe. But it's the kind of phrase you don't forget. It wasn't just what they did at Al-Aqsa, it's what they didn't do. No chapels were constructed, no shrines erected. The site wasn't transformed into a typical Christian sanctuary. Instead, it was preserved, stabilized. As if the Templars feared altering it too much. As if they knew something slept beneath it and weren't sure what might happen if it was disturbed. A theory gaining momentum in esoteric circles suggests the Templars believed Al-Aqsa was sitting atop a veil, a weak place between realms, spiritual and physical. They may have interpreted its architecture as a kind of containment device, a sacred stopper preventing something older, more volatile from rising. If so, then their mission wasn't just excavation, it was stewardship. Not to unlock something, but to watch it, guard it, maybe even delay it. And that would explain their obsession, why they refused to give it up, why even as their influence spread across Europe, their most sacred base remained a structure they didn't build, didn't modify, and didn't advertise. Because deep down, perhaps the Templars weren't trying to reclaim holy ground. Maybe they were trying to stop time. One scholar, a gentle, bespectacled Italian named Marco Bettini, once put it this way in a whispered lecture in Venice: we think of Al-Aqsa as the stage. But to them, it was the lid. The lid of what remains the question. There's something peculiar about the way legends echo through stone. They don't fade, not really. They linger encoded in carvings, whispered in misremembered tales, sometimes misfiled in dusty archives no one visits anymore. But when you line up the stories, the sketches, the scratches in the walls, they start to rhyme. And in the case of the Templars, what begins as myth may actually lead you straight into mortar and dust. By the late 12th century, as the Templar presence in Jerusalem grew bolder, so too did the whispers that they weren't just warriors or monks, but seekers of something buried. That alone wouldn't be strange. Jerusalem was always an archaeological temptation, but what made the Templars' behavior unique was the specificity of their obsession. They weren't wandering the old city with pickaxes and prayers. They were zeroed in, fixated on a narrow band beneath the Temple Mount, one that curiously aligned with a set of ancient Hebrew myths surrounding Solomon's catacombs. Several midrashic texts, little known outside rabbinical circles, speak of chambers built by Solomon, not just to house the ark, but to safeguard writings not meant for the days of kings. These were not the proverbs nor the songs. These were the so-called words of the flame prophetic writings, too dangerous or too destabilizing to be included in any canon. One rabbinic tale tells of a stone door with no seam buried under dust, marked only by the sigil of the fifth star. No one's quite sure what the fifth star refers to, but the Templars must have had some idea. Because on at least 3 surviving wall fragments from their tunnels under the mount, there appears a chiseled 5-pointed mark, small, deliberate, and unmistakable. The connection to maps begins in the 1160s, when a Templar outpost in Provence recorded the arrival of a scroll in copper likeness said to depict the interior of the sanctum as written by the desert people. This is widely believed to be a Crusader copy of the infamous Copper Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls found centuries later near Qumran. Unlike the others, the Copper Scroll reads like a treasure inventory, lists of hidden hoards, buried vessels, sacred objects, and quantities of gold. But the locations are maddeningly vague under the ruins of the Valley of Achor, north of the double portico below the third cistern. What stands out is that several of these phrases appear paraphrased in Templar marginalia, found in manuscripts housed in the Vatican's secret archives. Whether copied, translated, or filtered through oral tradition, they seem to suggest that the Templars believed some of the locations described in the Copper Scroll corresponded with underground chambers in Jerusalem, possibly beneath Solomon's temple itself. There's one especially intriguing passage that describes a twisted corridor lined with 7 stones leading to the speaking wall. That phrase, speaking wall, appears in an anonymous 13th century Templar diary discovered in Rouen in 1921. The diary's author claimed that certain underground passages caused odd acoustic phenomena, that whispered words could travel unnaturally far, that walls would seem to murmur when touched. He speculated with a touch of monastic dread that the chambers had been constructed with deliberate sonic properties, perhaps to transmit chants, perhaps something else. Either way, the overlap of language is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Modern archaeologists might scoff, but there's a fact they can't escape beneath the Temple Mount. There are passageways and staircases that serve no structural function. In 2013, a leaked report from a private European archaeological group denied access to the site, but using ground-penetrating radar from surrounding rooftops, claimed to detect voids forming a pentagonal pattern beneath the southeastern corner of the mount. This pattern does not match any known construction under Herod, nor does it align with Islamic-era architectural features. But it does align curiously with an obscure Templar floor plan found in a ruined chapel in Languedoc, labeled simply Via Coelestis, the Way of Heaven. That phrase alone would be easy to ignore. But it reappears in Templar poetry, in carved inscriptions, even in a fragment of a sermon attributed to Jacques de Molay. It is always capitalized, always singular, always directional, and always paired with stars, gates, or stone. A controversial interpretation suggests that the Templars weren't just mapping chambers. They were replicating something. That their cathedrals, crypts, and chapter houses across Europe weren't just religious buildings, but echoes. Replicas of a sacred architecture buried in Jerusalem. Architecture they had seen, measured, maybe even memorized. One little-known example supports this. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Cambridge, often attributed to Templar design, contains a circular nave remarkably similar in dimensions to the Dome of the Rock, not just in width, but in the number and spacing of its columns. Critics call this a coincidence of style, but the alignments are too precise, the dimensions too deliberate. It's as if the builders were reconstructing a memory, a buried geometry. And why would they do that unless the original structure, whatever it was beneath Solomon's temple, was no longer accessible? Or worse, not safe to access again. So perhaps their mission wasn't to unearth something for public display. Perhaps it was to preserve it encoded in stone, hidden in symmetry, whispered through vaults and ribs and arches. A kind of masonry language for those who knew how to read the stars. In that sense, the Templars weren't just knights. They were cartographers of the unseen. It is one of the strangest artifacts ever pulled from the Judean desert, a text not on parchment, not on papyrus, but hammered onto copper. While the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls offered spiritual guidance hymns, apocalyptic visions, and fragments of ancient scripture, this one, the so-called Copper Scroll, read like a ledger. No prayers, no poetry, just a list. A very specific, very detailed list of hidden treasures. 64 entries, to be exact. Gold bars, silver ingots, priestly vessels, scrolls sealed in wax, and measures of incense buried in places marked only by vague, poetic coordinates. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor under the steps leading east, 42 talents of silver. In the tomb under the great cistern in the courtyard of the house of Hakos, 70 talents of gold. It's the kind of list that sounds like the fever dream of a bored scribe, or the roadmap of someone who knew far more than he should have. Now imagine that scroll, or a copy of it, found its way into the hands of a group of night monks in Jerusalem. Imagine they had the resources to follow those hints. Imagine they believed those hints led not only to wealth, but to revelation. This is not pure fantasy. A growing number of scholars, still a minority, but no longer laughed out of the room, believed that some version of the Copper Scroll was circulating among Latin Christian circles during the Crusades. The proof marginal notes found in 12th century Templar manuscripts contain phrases eerily similar to those found on the scroll: the twin pillars of the spring, the vault beneath the steps, the third stone from the southern gate. These aren't common expressions. They are breadcrumbs scattered across geography and time. What makes the Templar connection even more tantalizing is the specificity of their tunneling beneath the Temple Mount. You'll remember that several early Templar documents reference the place of silence below the sanctuary. That phrase, or something close to it, also appears in the Copper Scroll's 39th entry, describing a chamber beneath the place of the seventh measure, containing a sealed vessel and a text of thunder. What is a text of thunder, no one knows. But the Templars seemed interested enough in this place of silence to spend years digging toward it. A lesser-known historical detail adds fuel to the fire. In 1173, a scribe in Antioch penned a complaint to the papal legate claiming that the knights have diverted funds from the church to pursue fruitless digs beneath the mosque. The letter was dismissed at the time, but it suggests an internal debate was brewing not just over the legality of the Templars' actions, but over their purpose. Were they really there to protect pilgrims, or to uncover something best left buried? There's one particularly strange episode that scholars tend to gloss over. In 1187, when Saladin's forces recaptured Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the tunnels beneath it were retaken. Yet according to a diary from one of Saladin's engineers, much of the underground was already sealed with stone and chalk, unbreachable by hammer. Why would the Templars, knowing the city was about to fall, waste precious hours filling in holes? Unless, of course, they had found something and didn't want anyone else to find it. One possible clue lies not in the Middle East, but in England, in the 1960s during restoration work at the Templar Church in Royston. Workers discovered an underground chamber. The walls were covered in crude carvings, knights with swords, saints with halos, stars, crosses, serpents, and in one niche, what appears to be a scroll unrolling from the mouth of a horned figure. Some see it as allegorical. Others see it as a message, especially because beneath the carving, faint but legible, is a phrase in Latin: vocem de subterraneo, the voice from beneath. The Copper Scroll has no known conclusion. It ends mid-sentence. Some believe that's because it was damaged. Others believe it was never meant to end because the real ending was hidden elsewhere, or perhaps passed on. And here's the strangest echo of all. In 1307, when the Templar order was arrested en masse on Friday the 13th, one of the charges brought against them among the litany of blasphemies and heresies was this: they possessed a document in metal engraved with numbers and sacred names said to reveal the place of the hidden ones. That phrase, the hidden ones, doesn't match any known Christian theology. But it does match a Qumran-era phrase found in another scroll, the War Scroll, where a secret sect awaits a coming war from below. The idea that such apocalyptic language may have passed through centuries, through exiles, through crusades, and into the hands of armored mystics, is chilling. The question, of course, is not whether the Templars had a copy of the Copper Scroll. The real question is, which parts of it did they believe? Every school child knows the legend, the Ark of the Covenant built by Moses, enshrined by Solomon, vanished without a trace. It held the tablets of the law, a rod that budded, and manna from heaven. And somewhere along the dusty corridors of time it slipped out of history into myth. Naturally, when the Templars began their curious residence atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the whispers began. Of course, they were searching for the Ark. What else could possibly warrant that kind of secrecy? And yet, for all the speculation, all the sermons and scrolls and Hollywood scripts, the Templars never claimed to have found it. No relic matching its description ever surfaced. No chronicler, not even those who delighted in scandal, accused the Templars of hiding the Ark. In all the raids, all the inquisitions, all the torture-induced confessions, silence. Almost as if that wasn't the point. That silence is more interesting than any boast, because if the Ark was the obvious treasure, the thing every crusader dreamed of, then the absence of evidence becomes a clue in itself. It suggests that the Templars either never found the Ark, or found something they believed was far more important. Several competing theories have emerged. Some posit that the Ark had already been moved centuries earlier to Ethiopia or Egypt, a theory held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which claims to guard the Ark in Axum to this day. Others believe it was hidden by Jewish priests during the Babylonian siege and never recovered. But a more curious idea comes from a 14th-century Carthusian monk named Laurentius de Montferrat, who claimed in a lost but partially quoted treatise that the brothers in the East discovered not the chest, but its echo. Whatever that means, it suggests the Templars weren't chasing the artifact, but something the artifact pointed to. One school of thought suggests the Ark wasn't merely a container, but a transmitter, an object designed to amplify divine presence. If that's true, then the Templars may have been seeking not the Ark itself, but the technology behind it. That would explain why they tunneled not toward mythical vaults, but along ley lines, solstice points, and places of spiritual convergence. They may have been searching for the formula, not the furniture. Consider this in a lesser-known Templar manuscript housed in Braga, Portugal. There's a diagram of what appears to be an altar, not the Ark, but something similar in dimensions, surrounded by not cherubim, but stars. The caption beneath it reads, Orbis Causarum, the Wheel of Causes. Scholars have interpreted it as a philosophical doodle, but one physicist drawn in by the geometric precision suggested it could represent harmonic resonance patterns, sound waves intentionally mapped into stone. And if you're wondering why on earth medieval knights would care about that, well, welcome to the Templars. They weren't just soldiers. They weren't just monks. They were part of an esoteric tradition that blended theology, alchemy, sacred geometry, and a good deal of intellectual arrogance. They believed the ancients knew things that had been lost, and they believed it was their job to recover that knowledge and protect it. Which brings us back to the Ark, or rather, its absence. In the years following the Templars' retreat from Jerusalem, several mysterious shipments were sent west. One in particular from Acre to Marseille in 1291 contained unspeakable cargo, according to the ship's manifest, a phrase usually reserved for relics or bones. The ship vanished in the Mediterranean. No trace of it was ever found. But years later, in the Templar commandery of Aragon, a chapel was built with inscriptions referencing the voice of God in exile. What was that voice? Was it metaphor? Or was it something preserved, replicated, hidden, The Templars certainly acted like men who'd seen something dangerous. After their years beneath the Temple Mount, they changed. Their rituals became stranger, their architecture more symbolic, their finances more opaque. They ceased to act like a growing religious order and more like a society guarding a countdown. Here's a peculiar callback. Remember the text of thunder from the Copper Scroll, that mysterious phrase suggesting a kind of explosive revelation? Well, a stone fragment unearthed in a former Templar chapel in Poitiers bears an inscription, Verbum Tonitruum, the word of thunder. Beneath it, etched faintly, a depiction of a box with wings and fire emerging from its lid. Not quite the biblical ark, but something that might once have inspired it. It's possible the Templars didn't find the ark because it was never there. It's also possible they did find it, or something like it, and decided the world wasn't ready. Not ready for what it could do. Not ready for what it meant. Not ready for the possibility that the holiest object in Judeo-Christian lore wasn't a relic at all, but a warning. So no, they didn't find the ark. But they found its outline, its reflection, and maybe its purpose. It didn't glitter. It didn't pulse with divine light. It wasn't carved from gold or inlaid with lapis. But those who claim to have seen it, and there are only a few scattered whispers, say it chilled them to the marrow. It wasn't a relic. It was a document. A single piece of parchment brittle with age and heavy with implication. Known only by its nickname in later Templar circles, the Document of Dread. No confirmed copy exists. No photograph, no transcription, not even a reliable summary. And yet, like the outline of a shark beneath black water, its shape can be inferred by the ripples it caused. The first hint comes from a letter dated around 1130, discovered in the Abbey of Clairvaux among Bernard of Clairvaux's papers. It references the parchment brought by the brothers from the East, whose words cannot be repeated without peril. That's an odd phrase, especially coming from a man known for his poetic theology. It suggests not only secrecy, but danger. And it implies that the document's contents were not merely controversial, they were catalytic. A century later, the 13th century chronicler Alberic of Trois Fontaines wrote of a scroll so ancient it bore no script of men given to the Templars by those who watched the gates. Many scholars dismiss this as metaphor or monastic flair. But the phrasing "those who watched the gates" reappears in an obscure Arabic manuscript from the same period referencing Christian soldiers who questioned the keepers of the mountain. Was there some esoteric exchange between the Templars and Eastern mystics? A trade of secrets beneath the radar of Church and Crown. One interpretation, the most persistent and troubling, is that the Document of Dread contained a prophecy. Not one pulled from Scripture, but from a source older than any known gospel, a vision possibly carved or transcribed by an ancient sect, predicting the fall of kingdoms, the corruption of faith, and the return of something long exiled. And the worst part, the implication that the Templars weren't trying to prevent it, but to prepare for it. This idea gained traction in the early 20th century, when a fragment of parchment surfaced in southern France bearing what some believed to be a quote from the lost document, "When the sun stands still and the east sings, the seal shall open." That fragment has since vanished conveniently, some would say, but not before it was photographed and published by a fringe but oddly well-connected Jesuit scholar named Émile Gravois. Gravois claimed the phrase matched a line from a lost Templar rite whispered during the midnight vigil of Holy Week. Others dismissed it as forgery, but there were just enough coincidences, especially the use of the phrase, "the seal shall open," which appears nowhere else in known liturgy, to keep the theory flickering like a candle in a draught. More recently, in 2006, a private collector in Lisbon, unearthed a coded missive from a 14th-century Templar sympathizer sent decades after the order's dissolution. The letter refers to the parchment that caused the weeping of the master, presumed to be Jacques de Molay. It claims that the scroll was copied once, hidden twice, and read thrice, each reading aligned with a crisis in Christendom. First during the fall of Jerusalem, then during the rise of the Inquisition, and finally, well, that part remains speculative. So what could this document have contained? Some theorize it was a doomsday calendar pointing not to an apocalypse in the biblical sense, but a slow unraveling of spiritual truth, culminating in the loss of meaning itself. Others believe it described a cycle of concealment and revelation, wherein ancient knowledge would be hidden, then rediscovered, only to be buried again, as if mankind were too fragile to hold the truth for long. A few believe it predicted the fall of the Church, the return of a forgotten bloodline, or the awakening of something beneath Jerusalem. Choose your flavor of dread. But the most compelling and most disturbing theory is that it wasn't just predictive, it was instructive. That the document gave the Templars a blueprint, not just for preservation, but for manipulation, a schedule, a script, a prophecy to be fulfilled, not avoided. This may explain why the Templars operated with such eerie calm in the face of their own demise. When Philip IV turned against them, when arrests swept through Europe, when their leaders were chained and tortured and burned, they did not scream of innocence. They did not name the kings who owed them gold. They did not reveal the locations of vaults or the names of allies. It's as if they had already accepted the fall, as if it too had been foretold. Remember the callback from earlier, that odd Templar term, via Celestis, the way of heaven. In one confiscated Templar manuscript, it appears alongside a stylized drawing of a split world, one side light, the other shadow, divided by a sword. Beneath it, a single Latin phrase, non finis sed gradus. Not the end, but the step. Perhaps the Templars believed they were taking that step. Perhaps they believed the document of dread wasn't a warning. It was a mandate. It began to surface in fragments, not all at once, and not in any one place. A diagram in a Templar codex in Aragon. A cryptic line in a letter from a knight of Champagne. A mosaic pattern hidden beneath the choir floor of a ruined commandery in Yorkshire. On their own, nothing special. But together, when viewed as overlapping echoes rather than isolated noise, they reveal a thread, one that coils tightly around the question historians fear to ask. What if the Templars weren't simply guarding something, but building toward it? The distinction matters. Guardianship is passive. Construction implies intent, a plan. And among Templar scholars who dare to stray from safe academic shores, a growing theory has taken root that scattered across Templar texts and temples lies the skeleton of a prophecy. Or perhaps worse, a blueprint. Let's return to a strange codex discovered in 1917 during the excavation of an old Templar site in Tamar, Portugal. Known as the Liber Obscura, it's a worn and water-damaged manuscript containing symbols, alchemical notations, and a circular diagram labeled Ordo Ascensionis. In the margins, faded but legible, are phrases in Latin, "Those below must rise and prepare the chamber, not the blade." Most medieval texts would accompany such language with theology or allegory. This one does not. There are no saints, no Christ, no devil. Only numbers, stars, and shapes. A calendar without names. Some argue the Liber Obscura is just a mystical meditation. But one detail complicates that dismissal. A grid embedded in the circle precisely matches the star alignment over Jerusalem during the winter solstice of 1119, the same year the original 9 Templars requested quarters atop the Temple Mount. That's not the only alignment. A fresco in a Templar chapel near Perpignan contains a depiction of three towers, one whole, one cracked, one toppled. Beneath them are Hebrew letters spelling out hevel, meaning breath vapor, or futility. A subtle nod, perhaps, to the fleeting nature of power. But the towers themselves are unmistakably stylized versions of the Dome of the Rock, drawn in 3 stages. Their destruction, it would seem, had been contemplated. One open question often raised and just as often buried by scholars is why the Templars placed such emphasis on sequence. Not just secrecy, not just symbolism, but order, step by step, piece by piece. Their rituals had timing, their architecture had echo, their texts had nested meanings, things you could only understand if you had already read the right thing, seen the right floor, heard the right phrase whispered at the right moment. In other words, it wasn't just a prophecy, it was an instruction manual. We can revisit Bernard of Clairvaux's letter from the early 1130s. While known for spiritually endorsing the Templars, there's one odd paragraph scholars tend to glide over. In it, Bernard refers to the knights not as guardians, but as machina Dei, the machine of God. The term is strange, jarring even. It implies function, purpose, not piety. And while some brush it off as flowery language, it shows up again almost a century later in an intercepted Templar communication seized in Venice, this time reading, "Let the machine turn. The gate must open from within." A gate to what that question takes us to the Temple Mount itself. During the brief British Mandate in the early 20th century, several unauthorized surveys were conducted by European archaeologists. In a declassified report, a French team documented underground chamber measurements that curiously matched the proportions found in Templar round churches across Europe. Not similar. Identical down to the radius of the ambulatory arch and the spacing of columns. The implication: these weren't just stylistic choices. They were replicas, templates, coded blueprints repeated in stone across continents. If you buy into that premise, the theory deepens. Perhaps the churches were never meant simply for worship. Perhaps they were part of a network, a pattern, a map drawn in sacred geometry anchored in Jerusalem and echoed throughout Christendom, each one a node in a greater design calibrated to some future date. Which brings us to a controversial discovery made during the excavation of a Templar ruin in southwestern France in 1994. Buried beneath the altar stone was a metal disc etched with planetary alignments and a Latin phrase, dies refractionis, the day of refraction. Theorists believe it refers to a moment when the veil between realms, spiritual, dimensional, however one chooses to define it, becomes thin enough for something to pass through. A date, a countdown, a keystone in the blueprint. But if such a date was known, it has long since been buried or encoded. Perhaps that was the plan: to disperse the components across Europe, to prevent any one king, pope, or rival order from assembling the whole. And that would mean the Templars did not just carry a secret. They were the secret. A walking, praying, sword-bearing algorithm designed to execute a plan spanning centuries. A machine not of war, but of memory. So was it prophecy or blueprint? Was the knowledge they uncovered beneath Solomon's temple meant to foretell the future, or to build it? It's one of the most iconic images associated with the Templars, 2 knights armored and stern riding a single horse. At first glance, it's an emblem of humility. 2 men sharing a mount, symbolizing poverty, brotherhood, sacrifice. That's the standard explanation. But in recent decades, as more scholars have revisited Templar symbology with fresh eyes and perhaps less reverence, that interpretation has begun to wobble. Because there's something odd about that seal, not just in its imagery, but in its origin. The double rider seal appears for the first time during the early leadership of Hugues de Payens, the Templars' first Grand Master. Yet it is not a standard military or monastic image. No other knightly order used anything like it. No monastic seals show shared horses. In fact, within medieval symbology, horses typically signify spiritual authority or divine favor, and more often than not, one rider. The Templar seal, by contrast, is jarringly asymmetrical, uncomfortable, intentional. Some historians now argue that the seal wasn't a declaration of poverty at all, but a coded message, a symbol of duality, above and below, seen and unseen, the visible mission of the Templars and the hidden purpose buried beneath it. To support that theory, let's turn to a manuscript uncovered in the 18th century in the Vatican's restricted archives, known only by its catalog number MSS Cod. 1184 Vox, but often referred to informally as the Quiet Ledger. This manuscript contains annotations believed to be penned by Hugues de Payens himself. Among the Latin phrases is a curious line, et erit unus inter duos et alter videbit in tenebris. And there shall be one among the two, and the other shall see in darkness. The line is baffling, poetic, yes, but also precise. It suggests a division of roles, a mission shared between two paths, one public, one occult. In this context, the seal becomes more than a symbol. It becomes a map. It's worth noting that around this same time, several early Templar buildings began to include twin spiral staircases. In most castles or monasteries, staircases spiral in one direction for defense or efficiency. But Templar structures in Tamar-Leon, and even in remote outposts like Loire, display a peculiar feature: twin spirals winding side by side, one ascending, one descending. Architecturally beautiful, logistically unnecessary, symbolically deliberate. Some esoteric researchers have speculated these staircases represent the twin paths of Templar service, the Milites Christi, who fought above, and the Custodes Veritatis, who guarded what lay below. Could Hugues de Payens have been encoding this dual function into the Templar seal itself? A minor but persistent detail comes from a letter written in 1128 by Count Fulk of Anjou, a major supporter of the Templars, in which he refers to the order not as Pauperes Camilitones, Christi their formal Latin name, but as Gemini Armati, the armed twins. While most have assumed this was metaphor in light of the seal, the phrase takes on added weight. Were the Templars divided by design, even more provocative is the so-called Scion fragment unearthed in a suppressed collection of Rosicrucian writings from the 1600s. It tells the story of two initiates, one who sees the stars, the other who hears the voice beneath the stone. They are bound together by oath, but separated in purpose. It's clearly allegorical, but the parallels are hard to ignore. As for Hugues himself, the historical record is suspiciously thin. We know he led the order. We know he traveled widely, but beyond that, he exists mostly in shadows. His writings are few, his birthplace disputed, his motivations unclear. It's almost as if the man who supposedly founded one of the most powerful organizations of the Middle Ages left no real trace. Unless, of course, the trace is the seal. That cryptic image of shared burden split destiny. One final twist, and it's almost too perfect. In 2003, a stone carving was found beneath a Templar site in southern Italy, hidden behind a collapsed wall. It depicts a horse not with two knights, but with one rider holding a mirror. Reflected in the glass is a second figure cloaked featureless. The carving bears no text, but the style and iconography match early 12th century work. Some believe it predates the official seal. If that's true, It suggests the two riders were never about economics, never about humility. They were about seeing and hiding, riding forward and watching behind. One for the world above, the other for whatever they had found beneath Solomon's temple. So when you look at the Templar seal, now don't see poverty, see tension, intention. And remember, symbols lie when they must, but they also whisper if you know how to listen. They weren't supposed to find it, not in the open, not with torches and trumpets. What lay beneath the Temple Mount had been buried for a reason, not just physically entombed under rock and ash, but architecturally forgotten. Successive empires had built over it, walled it off, repurposed it, erased it. And still, it waited. By the late 20th century, ground-penetrating radar began to do what no crusader, caliph, or archaeologist had ever quite managed to peer below without breaking ground. And what it revealed beneath the southeastern quadrant of the Temple Mount stunned even the most conservative researchers. Chambers, shafts, voids arranged in patterns that didn't match any known construction phase from Herod's temple, nor from Islamic expansion. Some of them were geometrically regular, others were oddly shaped like the negative space left behind by vanished machines. But let's roll back a few centuries, because long before radar, the Templars already knew there was something there. They had no satellites, no seismic scans, just instinct whispers, and a few very old, very strange maps. One of those maps, believed to have been transcribed from an earlier Hebrew original, surfaced in 1871 in a Jesuit archive in Córdoba. It depicts the Temple Mount not as a flat platform, but as a layered structure with a second sanctum hidden beneath, accessible only through a narrow passage marked ad filum tenebrarum, at the thread of shadows. At first dismissed as mystical nonsense, the map's annotations match some of the architectural anomalies confirmed by modern scans, particularly a downward shaft near the eastern wall, long thought to be a simple cistern, but now considered part of a vertical chamber system. The Templars weren't digging blindly. They were following a design. Eyewitness accounts from early Islamic historians mention that when the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, they desecrated the Dome of the Rock, converting it into a church. But few mention what they did underneath. A 12th century Muslim historian, Ibn al-Qalanisi, makes a brief and easily overlooked note that the Franks sent slaves into the lower catacombs, where none had trod in living memory. Slaves, he says. But in some Templar records, there's reference to brothers of silence men who took no vows of war, only of secrecy. A parallel, perhaps. Or the same labor force seen through two different filters. In either case, they went below, and something changed. Accounts from returning knights mention dreams, visions, sudden conversions to mystical contemplation. Hugues de Payan himself, once known for battlefield valor, reportedly ceased speaking of military matters entirely after his years in Jerusalem. Some called it spiritual growth, others quiet madness. A particularly strange anecdote comes from a Cistercian abbot in Burgundy who visited a Templar commandery in 1146. He wrote in his journal of a conversation with an unnamed knight who claimed to have stood inside the bones of the world. The phrase has no immediate theological meaning, but later Templar inscriptions found in chapels from Scotland to Catalonia repeat it. Not carved, but painted. Quiet. Like a reminder passed along in hushed continuity. If something existed beneath the temple, a structure, a chamber, a sanctum, what was it? Not the ark, not treasure. Those were surface-level distractions, the bait for greedy kings and hopeful pilgrims. No, the most compelling theory is that what lay below was not a relic, but a container. Not of objects, but of information. A room sealed with intention, designed to preserve or possibly restrain something dangerous. A 14th century Templar text, seized and buried in the Vatican's Index, refers to the inferior oratory of Zion, a phrase so unorthodox it barely fits in Latin. It describes a domed chamber inscribed with symbols that spoke without voice, and a pedestal not made by our hands. The writer, anonymous and clearly nervous, warns that the chamber is not to be entered in times of joy, nor when the moon sleeps. Cryptic, absolutely. But echoes of this idea appear in the Gothic architecture of Templar cathedrals, where lunar cycles were often encoded into stone, not as decoration, but as countdowns. One of the more shocking archaeological confirmations comes from a 1974 Israeli excavation conducted under emergency political permissions following a wall collapse near the mount. The team discovered what appeared to be a shaft ending in a sealed stone slab etched with a symbol resembling an eye inside a triangle. Yes, the very same symbol often associated with later Masonic lore. The slab was never opened. Political tensions halted the dig, and the shaft was resealed. Official reports claimed the site was unstable. Unofficial reports claimed the slab vibrated when touched. Is it all dramatic coincidence? Possibly. But the consistency of these accounts across languages, centuries, and continents makes hand-waving increasingly difficult. Too many Templars said too little and left behind too much. So perhaps beneath the temple mount, there wasn't a treasure waiting to be looted. There was a design waiting to be reactivated, a chamber or mechanism or archive built not by Solomon, but by those who whispered to him from the dark. And the Templars didn't just find it, they may have awakened it. There are languages meant to be spoken, soft vowels passed from mother to child, war cries hurled across open fields. And then there are languages meant only for stone, for hands, not mouths, chiseled rather than recited. And beneath the temple mount, the Templars may have found one of the oldest. At first, it must have looked like graffiti, scrawls across limestone, marks scratched into dusty pillars half erased by time. But these were not crusader crosses or careless mason signatures. They were older, stranger. And once the Templars began to document them, and they did meticulously, patterns emerged. Symmetry, recurrence, syntax. According to a copy of a Templar field record found in a remote Portuguese archive in 1892, the knights referred to these marks as verba caeca, blind words. They believed the symbols were left by builders before Babel, a phrase that jars even the most myth-friendly scholar. But the handwriting is clear. The diagrams are careful. Someone believed they were deciphering a forgotten tongue. Fast forward to the 20th century, when British linguist Reginald Bainbridge analyzed high-resolution photographs of symbols recovered from a Templar chapel in Cyprus. He noticed something unusual. The strokes didn't align with known Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or Arabic. Instead, several resembled Proto-Canaanite characters, a script predating classical Hebrew, spoken by the region's early Semitic tribes. But even within Proto-Canaanite, the characters were wrong, reversed, tilted. Some carved backward, others looped like spirals, not mistakes patterns, intentional disruption. Bainbridge called it a contradictory script, one that seemed designed to resist reading. A language not for communication, but concealment. The Templars, ever the builders, seemed to intuit that. Their own architectural features began to echo these symbols. Columns subtly twisted to mimic the spiral glyphs. Floor tiles arranged in concentric octagons matching the inscribed diagrams. And most telling of all, altar placements that aligned not with Christian liturgical direction, but with the rising of stars named in Babylonian astronomy. One especially cryptic symbol appeared across 4 Templar sites in Europe, a 5-pronged fork set within a circle etched into cornerstone blocks. No Christian meaning, no Jewish precedent. But in Mesopotamian myth, the hand of fire, 5 rays, one unseen, was said to mark the tomb of a sleeping god. In a letter attributed to a Templar commander in Tripoli, preserved in a French Cistercian archive, he writes of unreading the stones. He claims the symbols once seen in sequence reverse the tongue and open the gate beneath thought. Mad ramblings, perhaps. But the same letter includes exacting floor measurements and star alignments consistent with Templar consecrated architecture. A recurring phrase in these texts, lingua sub silentio. The language beneath silence appears again in a puzzling marginal note written by Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, who shaped the spiritual justification of the Templars, seems to hint at something he was told or shown, but could not record plainly. There are prayers not for mouths, he writes, and meanings not for books. There is a silence more dangerous than heresy. That silence carried into the Inquisition trials. When Templar leaders were interrogated under duress, many confessed to strange rituals. One described a ceremony in which a novice was shown a stone marked with the name of the unspeakable. Another claimed the brothers listened to the wall, believing it would answer. Outlandish, of course. But woven between these theatrical confessions is a consistent thread language not used for speech but against it. Something meant to lock meaning in place. Which leads us to the most haunting idea. What if these weren't just inscriptions left by ancient builders? What if they were warnings, seals, codes not meant to be read but to contain? A Templar fragment recovered from a ruined chapel in Tuscany contains a drawing of a man kneeling before a wall etched with symbols. Rays of light are drawn, piercing his head. Below it, a caption, Intellectum Mortis, the death of understanding. Scholars dismissed it as allegory. But when compared to Mesopotamian curse tablets, which also use spirals, reversals, and wordplay, the parallels are difficult to ignore. It's as if the builders of this hidden chamber beneath the Temple Mount spoke a language of conceptual encryption, a code not just for the eyes, but for the soul. A language that traps rather than reveals. And the Templars, whether through arrogance or awe, tried to speak it again. One callback, and a chilling one earlier, we noted that during the 1974 excavation near the Mount, a sealed stone slab was found bearing a symbol later linked to Masonic lore. That same symbol appears on a column in the Templar Round Church in London. But beneath the London carving is an inscription in Latin Custodes Linguae Dormientis, guardians of the sleeping language. A language that once fully read might not translate into words, but into events. It was discovered by accident or so, the archivist claimed. A misfiled bundle of parchment in the monastery of Le Thoronay, Provence, tucked inside a 12th century hymnal. At first glance, it seemed to be little more than a homily draft, perhaps scribbled by a bored scribe. But the language was wrong. The tone, off. It wasn't a sermon, it was a revelation. A doctrine whispered among Templar circles and never meant for mass ears. They called it Doctrina Quinta Columna, the fifth pillar doctrine. On the surface, it sounds simple enough. The document speaks of 5 pillars that hold the world in balance. Not physical columns, but forces light word bloodstone, and one unnamed. The first 4 were recognizable within mystical traditions of the time. Light for knowledge, word for divine law, blood for sacrifice, stone for permanence. But the 5th, the text avoids naming it directly. Instead, it offers a cryptic line. The 5th stands buried for to name it is to wake it. That phrase appears again later in the manuscript, this time paired with a crude diagram a five-pointed vault beneath a seven-rung ladder nestled beneath what is clearly a stylized rendering of Solomon's temple. Beneath it is written Sub Sion absconditum, hidden beneath Zion. Naturally, most mainstream historians have brushed off the document as Gnostic speculation or esoteric metaphor, but its provenance is hard to dismiss. The parchment dates to the mid-1100s. The ink analysis suggests was sourced from Syria, and the language, a strange hybrid of ecclesiastical Latin and Phoenician loanwords, suggests a mind trained in both Christian theology and older Eastern mystery traditions. The Templars, as you might expect, left no commentary. But clues linger in their structures. The Church of Leon, known for its uncanny symmetry, contains 5 main support columns in the nave, instead of the traditional 4, with the 5th slightly recessed and etched with an unmarked circle. In the Templar-built church of San Bevignate in Perugia, a faded fresco shows 5 robed figures standing beneath an inverted triangle of stars. One figure is missing a face. Below them is the phrase sine nomine sed presentia, without name but present. Taken alone, these would be little more than curiosities. But within the broader pattern of Templar activities beneath the Temple Mount, the obsession with geometry alignment secrecy, the 5th pillar begins to look less like a metaphor and more like a code. Some esoteric scholars believe it represented a concealed force, not evil necessarily, but wild, untamed, a divine chaos that had to be buried, not destroyed. The 5th pillar, they argue, was not a pillar at all, but a vault, a containment chamber, an idea so powerful it had to be sealed in form, not just word. The most radical version of this theory comes from the banned writings of 17th-century mystic Salvatore Melchior, who claimed the Templars discovered beneath the temple a void, a literal architectural anomaly, where stone bent unnaturally and sound failed to echo. Melchior wrote that the space swallowed meaning and that the 5th pillar was not holding the world up, but holding something down. This view, extreme though it is, fits oddly well with a Templar statement made under torture in 1308 by Jean de Chalon. He claimed that the order guarded a mouth in the earth and that it was never to be spoken into. The inquisitors dismissed the remark as delirium. But the phrasing is unnervingly consistent with 5th pillar language speech that awakens silence, that protects. One callback worth noting earlier, we examined the speaking wall from the Copper Scrolls echoes, that idea of inscriptions designed not for communication, but transformation. If the 5th pillar contained such language, if it wasn't a structure but a repository of inverted knowledge, then the Templars were not its builders. They were its wardens. This would also explain why, after their time in Jerusalem, the Templars seemed obsessed with replication. The round churches, the 5-point designs, the symbolic columns. Perhaps they weren't just memorializing the discovery, they were creating resonant anchors, architectural echoes, to suppress or redirect the influence of whatever the 5th pillar embodied. Curiously, in a letter intercepted by papal agents in 1309, one Templar refers to the broken pillar in Tomar as a warning and a sign. No one knows what he meant. But not long after, the commandery in Tomar underwent extensive renovations, with several columns replaced, one of which now bears a hidden chamber in its base, discovered only during a 20th century restoration. Inside, a sphere of blackened stone etched with 5 interlocking circles. Its purpose is still unknown. So what was the 5th pillar? A doctrine, A prophecy, A prison. Whatever it was, the Templars believed it mattered. Enough to hide it. Enough to die with it. Jerusalem, 1127. The wind that night came from the east, dry and restless, pushing dust through the narrow alleys of the old city. A hush settled over the Temple Mount, not the sacred hush of prayer, but the kind that descends before something breaks. and beneath the surface, somewhere in the cold guts of the earth, 3 men died. There is no monument, no grave markers, no official chronicle of what happened. But buried deep in the Vatican archives is a sealed record only referenced in passing during the suppression of the Templars, a parchment labeled Occultus Eventus Templi, the hidden event of the temple. According to its account, an underground collapse took place beneath the southeastern portion of the Al-Aqsa complex in the spring of 1127. 3 initiates were reportedly lost. The incident was not recorded in Jerusalem's official logs. No bodies were recovered. The document is terse, fractured Latin, legalistic in tone, but one line stands out: accessum ad quintum limen interdictum in perpetuum. Access to the 5th threshold is forbidden in perpetuity. 5th threshold. We've heard that number before. Earlier we explored the 5th pillar doctrine, a hidden element in Templar cosmology, something unnamed, buried, and dangerously sacred. If the 5th pillar represented a sealed force, perhaps the 5th threshold was its physical entry point. And maybe, just maybe, in 1127 the Templars tried to open it. The details are maddeningly scarce, but we can piece together a shadow. An unpublished letter from a Syrian monk housed in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana describes a great thunder beneath the mosque, followed by smoke like from burning scrolls. Another Crusader account, this one by a knight named Etienne de Marchand, refers to a sorrowful cry that rose from the earth like blood from a wound. Dramatic, certainly. But both accounts are dated to the same week, and neither had any apparent contact with the other. Modern geologists have examined the rock beneath the Temple Mount and confirmed it's riddled with natural voids, some created by ancient aquifers, others by quarrying in the Second Temple period. It's possible, they say, that a previously unknown tunnel system caved in, but the seismic records show no earthquake that week, no tremors, just silence. So why seal the records? Why not just call it an accident unless it wasn't? One of the most compelling and disturbing accounts comes from a fragment of Templar correspondence intercepted by Byzantine spies. In it, an unnamed knight writes to his commander in Acre, reporting the loss of 3 voices and a breach that sang before it fell. He ends the letter with a line that reads, "We lit no torch, and still the walls glowed." Of course, this kind of language walks the line between poetic and unhinged, but it's consistent. Other fragments refer to a moment of uncontainment and a door that folded inward. These weren't just metaphors. They were attempts, crude, terrified attempts, to describe something that was not supposed to happen. In the years that followed, Templar activity beneath the Temple Mount seems to have ceased. The digging stopped. Records go blank. Rituals shifted north toward Tamar and other European commanderies. It's as if the order re-centered itself away from Jerusalem, not because the Holy Land had lost significance, but because something had been disturbed and needed time to sleep. Here's where things get even stranger. A chapel in southern France, built decades later by returning knights, features a mural of 3 faceless men in white mantles descending into darkness. Above them, a painted sun cracks in 2. Below them, black roots twist around a broken column. Underneath the image, in Latin, non est hic finis sed recursus. This is not the end, but the returning. The mural was defaced during the French Revolution, but even now, beneath layers of plaster, parts of it remain. And what of the 3 initiates? Were they simply crushed beneath rubble? Maybe. But Templar death records, normally obsessively detailed, contain a gap that same spring. 3 names erased. No burial rites, no posthumous honors, just a line in the register marked "Vacat Void." There's one more oddity. In 1921, a British officer stationed in Jerusalem was given permission to inspect Crusader-era tunnels under the Al-Aqsa compound. He reported seeing a stone slab carved with 3 crosses, each one upside down. Below them in Greek, the word anastasis, resurrection. The report was classified. The tunnels were resealed. So what happened beneath the mount that night in 1127? An accident, a structural failure? Or did the Templars go too far, crack open something they could not fully close? Something they would spend the rest of their existence trying to contain, redirect, or perhaps delay. They never tried again. Not in Jerusalem, not directly. But the echoes of that collapse ripple outward still through frescoes, through cathedrals, through whispered rites practiced in the quietest corners of the world. And if the 5th pillar was a seal, then that night in 1127 was the first knock. They carved his face into the heart of a church, not at the top where angels flew, not at the sides where saints watched. No, at the base of a pillar crouched and grimacing, supporting the weight of the sacred. His name Asmodeus, the demon of lust, mischief, knowledge. Not exactly the figure one expects to find beneath the altar of a holy place. And yet, there he is hidden in plain sight in Rennes-le-Château, centuries after the fall of the Templars, a grotesque staring up from stone holding the basin of holy water on his back. To most, it's an architectural joke, a medieval warning against sin. But to a specific line of Templar scholars, it's something else entirely, a signature. The presence of Asmodeus in Templar-linked sites has baffled art historians for generations. He's not a standard motif. His depiction shifts, sometimes goat-like, sometimes winged, sometimes merely symbolic, but the name persists. In apocryphal texts, Asmodeus is the guardian of secrets, the one who knows the locations of hidden treasure, and who guards the vaults of kings. In the Book of Tobit, he is a destroyer of would-be unions, a force that interrupts, delays, obstructs. Strange bedfellow for a Christian order sworn to purity. But what if the Templars didn't see him as a threat, but as a lock? Let's recall the 5th pillar doctrine, the unnamed force buried beneath Zion, too dangerous to name, too volatile to release. If such a force existed, metaphorical or otherwise, would the Templars not have employed the strongest mythological barrier they could muster to keep it sealed? Not a wall, not a vault, a conceptual guardian, a being tied not to evil but to containment. In a suppressed Templar manuscript, seized in Avignon in 1309, now lost, but paraphrased in Inquisition notes, one passage reportedly refers to the one who bears the seal, a figure bound to the threshold of the lower temple. This bearer was not holy nor unholy, but necessary. The phrase custos inter limina appears, guardian between thresholds, and beside it, drawn in haste and fury, a horned face with hollow eyes. The same face found beneath the church at Rennes-le-Château. Coincidence, some would say so. But the pattern repeats. In the Templar preceptory at Templecombe, England, a ceiling painting was uncovered in the 20th century. It showed a bearded, frowning face with wide, knowing eyes, its features part human, part mask. Behind it, a curtain of stars. There was no accompanying text. But forensic dating places the painting to the late 13th century. Its stylistic elements match none of the surrounding Christian iconography. More intriguing still is a passage from a 12th century letter by a Templar stationed in Antioch. He writes of a gate sealed not with iron, but with identity, whose guardian knows no death, only interruption. The phrasing suggests something more than physical, a mythological role baked into the structure of secrecy. Asmodeus as archetype fits. The demon's association with hidden knowledge is not limited to Hebrew texts. In Persian folklore, a figure strikingly similar Ashma is also a guardian of secret places, one who distracts intruders with madness. Some believe these overlapping myths trace back to a single Mesopotamian root, a figure tasked with preventing unworthy mortals from unlocking what should remain closed. If the Templars unearthed something beneath Solomon's temple, and we've followed many signs that they did, then it's possible they recognized it not as treasure but as invitation. An open door, one they chose or were instructed to reseal. And like all seals, it needed a name, a guardian. Asmodeus may have been their chosen cipher, their personification of the boundary, a being that in public lore could be dismissed as a devil, in private circles understood as a lock. The presence of his likeness beneath Christian altars then becomes less sacrilegious, more strategic. He wasn't being worshipped. He was being bound, tasked with bearing the weight of what could not rise. A compelling footnote emerges from the confessions extracted from Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. Under torture, he was asked if the order worshipped demons. He denied it. But when pressed further about secret rituals involving a head, the so-called Baphomet, he gave a different answer. We speak not of demons, he is recorded to have said, but of watchers. That single word, watchers, resurfaces in early Jewish mysticism, referring to angels who fell for revealing hidden truths to mankind. Beings not evil, but estranged. Keepers of boundaries. And here we find the final echo. A carving discovered in a ruined commandery near Girona unearthed during a flood. It depicts a seated figure with its back to a door, arms outstretched, holding two chains, one attached to a sun, the other to a star. Beneath it, the Latin phrase, non aperies nisi tempus cadet. You shall not open it unless the time falls. A warning, or a condition. So perhaps Asmodeus wasn't the devil the Templars feared. Perhaps he was the guard they entrusted. Not a beast, not a symbol, a seal, waiting to be broken. It was said that the ceremony began in silence. No chants, no music. Just a torchlit descent into the earth, one hand on the shoulder of the brother ahead, the other gripping a candle that would not be lit until the lowest step had been reached. They called it the Path of the Eye, a rite of passage unlike any other in medieval Christendom, and one that few outside the Templar circle ever witnessed, and fewer still survived unchanged. Official Templar rulebooks, such as the Latin rule authored under Bernard of Clairvaux, make no mention of it. Those documents were public-facing, carefully worded to gain church approval. But from scattered trial records, leaked testimonies, and a handful of forbidden manuscripts that escaped the fire, we piece together a different image of subterranean rites of oaths, whispered beneath vaulted stone of symbols drawn in ash, salt, and breath. The clearest testimony comes from one Arnaud de Villiers, interrogated in 1308, under pain of death, and very likely after several nights without sleep. He described being led beneath a Templar chapel in Poitou, blindfolded, then forced to kneel before a stone marked with the eye that never closes. When the blindfold was removed, he found himself alone in a chamber with 3 doors and a single lamp. His task, he said, was not to choose a door, but to wait. And after 3 hours of silence, the central door opened on its own. It sounds like theater, psychological trial. But then he adds something curious. Behind the door was no person, no brother, no object, only a wall covered in writing. Writing he couldn't read. Writing he claimed moved like breath across stone. Of course, it's tempting to dismiss this as delusion. Torture and trauma yield strange memories. But a fragment recovered in the 1600s from a ruined Templar chapel in Auvergne seems to support his claim. It shows a carving of a kneeling figure before a stone wall with tendrils or possibly letters spiraling outward from a central eye. Beneath it, etched in faded Latin respice non loquere, look, do not speak. The imagery suggests something far more complex than fraternity initiation. It suggests a confrontation not with authority, but with knowledge, and perhaps with something deeper. In earlier chapters, we explored the possibility that beneath Solomon's temple, the Templars discovered not a relic, but a structure, a chamber sealed with both physical and metaphysical barriers. If true, then the rituals adopted afterward were not symbolic. They were reactive. The ceremonies were not about admission into the order. They were about survival. One minor but revealing detail comes from a confiscated letter found in the Templar ruins at Chinon. It reads, "Let no novice descend until the moon is past its gate." This reference to lunar phase as a condition of initiation hints at cosmological alignment. And in ancient traditions, lunar gates are not mere metaphors, they're temporal thresholds. Openings. If the chamber below the temple was believed to shift or breathe with lunar cycles, then timing would matter, not just for access, but for protection. An obscure commentary written by a monk sympathetic to the Templars speaks of a trial by darkness where light is enemy and silence shield. He suggests that the initiate must learn to listen, not with ears, but with presence. Another passage warns of voices in the stone that test the listener's resolve, voices that must not be answered. Ever. This brings us to one of the most disturbing themes in the confessions of Jacques de Molay's peers, the accusation that the Templars spoke to a head. Whether you interpret this as idol worship, symbolic meditation, or propaganda from frightened inquisitors, there is a persistent detail that defies easy categorization, the idea that something responded. A witness at the trial of Geoffrey de Gonneville claimed that when the head was revealed, a voice was heard, though no man spoke. The court scribes chalked it up to mass hysteria. But buried in that image is the same motif language without speaker knowledge, without teacher. Just like the writing on the wall in the initiation chamber. Just like the text of thunder from the copper scroll's shadowy cousin. Just like the fifth pillar's unspeakable core. So perhaps what the Templars feared or revered was not an object, but a presence. One bound by silence. One that could be glimpsed, but not named. And in their ceremonies, they weren't inducting new brothers. They were training witnesses, preparing them not just to hold secrets, but to resist hearing them too clearly. A callback worth noting: earlier, we encountered a phrase in a Templar chapel in Girona non aperis nisi tempus cadit. You shall not open it unless the time falls. The same phrase appears scrawled in near-identical script beneath a fresco in a ruined Templar commandery in Apulia, where a blindfolded man kneels before a black doorway. Again and again, the pattern repeats. Darkness, silence, the threshold, the unseen watcher. If the Templars' rituals seem strange, perhaps it's because they weren't designed for human benefit. Perhaps they were designed for containment, for delay, for insulation. The underground chamber wasn't a metaphor. It was a pressure valve. And every new initiate was one more finger on the seal. They came from the north, or perhaps the east. The records disagree, or more often fail to mention them entirely. But someone built what lay beneath the Temple Mount. Not the great platforms nor the Islamic domes that rose centuries later, but the narrow shafts, the spiral descents, the angular cuts in stone that predate even Herodian architecture. And the Templars knew they didn't build them. They only found them. The first reference comes from an offhand remark in a letter from a Templar commander in 1125. Writing to a brother in Acre, He complains that the ancients had no need of light to see their path. It reads like poetic exaggeration until you realize the context of the letter is subterranean. He wasn't describing modern engineers. He was describing something older. Modern archaeology confirms that beneath the Temple Mount, particularly around the southeastern and eastern regions, there are cut stones and chambers with tool marks inconsistent with Crusader or even Herodian methods. Stones are sliced at right angles without apparent chisel lines. Corners curve without obvious turning radius. Some passages lead nowhere only to seal into seamless walls, as if abandoned mid-thought or intentionally obscured. In the 1990s, infrared scans of substructure anomalies revealed a vault that matches no known construction plan. No pipes, no aqueduct function. Just space. Still sealed. Still waiting. So who built it? The most provocative clues come not from Jerusalem, but from Europe, scattered references in Templar archives to the Silent Ones, or muti operarii, mute laborers brought in from beyond the river. Some theorize this refers to Eastern stonemasons, perhaps Armenians, Persians, or distant monastic sects, but the records are suspiciously vague. Names are never listed. Numbers are inconsistent. And most chillingly, the same phrase appears again and again in the margins non redirunt, they did not return. One chronicle kept by a Cistercian abbot in Occitania records that the brothers who built the vaults of the southern gate were paid in gold, given no oaths, and left with no farewells. They spoke only when spoken to, and never slept within the walls. A strange arrangement for a monastic order which prided itself on community loyalty and structure. More haunting still is a French poem from the late 1100s, attributed to a lay brother of the Templars, that tells of men with eyes like salt, who carved stairs that turned back on themselves, and who vanished the morning after the last stone was placed. It sounds mythical, folkloric, until you realize the poem is preserved in the same monastery that housed early plans of the Temple Church in London, a structure whose underground chamber, when excavated centuries later, bore no trace of mortar or toolwork. A researcher at Oxford, Dr. Julian Caverley, published a paper in 2004, arguing that the Templars relied on a now-lost guild of stoneworkers, fluent in both sacred geometry and some forgotten rite of silence. According to him, these builders were less a labor force, more a ritual necessity, their presence required not for what they knew, but for what they did not speak. This aligns disturbingly well with a parchment fragment found in the Templar Preceptory of Aragon. It contains only a single sentence: those who carve the gate may not look through it. A rule, perhaps. A curse. A truth too dangerous to risk. Call back to the fifth pillar doctrine. Recall how it described a power buried beneath Zion, a force unnamed not to be awakened. If the Templars believed in such a presence, then they may have required not ordinary builders, but those outside the church, outside the order, even outside language. Workers who could lay stone, but not interpret it. Who could open passages without asking what might come through. The legend of the disappearing builders is not unique to the Templars. In Mesopotamian myth, the Temple of Enki was said to have been built by beings who returned to the stars. In Egypt, tales speak of foreign masons who constructed sacred geometry and vanished into sand. And among the Mandaeans of the Jordan Valley, whom we will meet again soon, there is a belief in Shaddaiya builders of holy houses who are summoned only once per age. A pattern emerges, one the Templars either tapped into or rediscovered. One more thread. A slab found in the Templar ruins of Gisors, Normandy, bore a carved spiral inside which was inscribed a simple phrase in Latin: servi non scientes, servants not knowing. So perhaps the Templars didn't build the tunnels. Perhaps they only uncovered them. And when they realized what they'd found, what still breathed behind those seamless stones, they did what any rational mystic would do. They paid the builders in gold and made sure they never returned. They are called Nazareans. In their own tongue, the Mandaeans, a dwindling people of secretive rites and star-born prayers clinging to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, their numbers eroded by war exile and time. They are among the last surviving Gnostic sects, and their mythology is older than the Quran, stranger than the Talmud, and more stubborn than the Church ever expected. And for reasons no mainstream history can adequately explain, the Templars seemed obsessed with them. It begins, as it often does, with a letter, this one from 1232, discovered in the personal archive of a Templar commander in Apulia. The author, a knight stationed in the Levant, writes cryptically of those who bear the old flood names and claims they spoke of the vault and the danger of reopening what their fathers sealed. This letter predates any formal European record of the Mandaeans by centuries. Yet the phrasing "old flood names" matches Mandaean myth precisely. They trace their origins to the time after the deluge, claiming descent from those who survived not through a covenant with God, but through knowledge, secret, blasphemous, preserved. The Mandaeans believe in duality, a world of light and a world of darkness, not good versus evil, but knowledge versus corruption. They venerate John the Baptist, but reject Jesus, whom they call a false Messiah. Their scripture, the Ginza Arba, describes a primordial struggle between watchers and rebels, creators and suppressors, between those who buried divine knowledge and those who guard it still. And in a passage now largely forgotten, the Ginza refers to a structure sealed beneath the place of Zion, where the voice of the deep once rose and fell silent. That silence, the text warns, must not be broken, for when it speaks again, the sons of men shall lose the stars. What were the Templars doing reading Mandaean scripture? The prevailing theory is trade, that during their presence in the Holy Land, particularly along routes that crossed through modern-day Iraq, they encountered Mandaean communities, and unlike church authorities who dismissed the sect as heretical vermin, the Templars listened. Perhaps because they were already deep in questions no bishop could answer. A callback to earlier, remember the initiation rituals conducted in the dark, the inscriptions that spoke without voice, the wall of the fifth pillar that could not be named. These match Mandaean descriptions of the dark chambers, a metaphysical space between worlds where knowledge is alive but unsafe. Mandaeans do not build shrines above these places. They avoid them, flee them. And yet in Crusader accounts from Antioch and Edessa, there are repeated mentions of local priests urging the knights not to dig, not because they feared desecration, but because the seal is not for men with swords. These warnings were ignored. In a Templar dispatch dated 1184, a commander complains of our Eastern brethren who sing at night and mourn the stone. This likely refers to a Mandaean sect in the region, known for their nocturnal rituals and funerary hymns. What stone they mourned is unclear. But the phrase reappears decades later in a Templar inventory of sacred objects, which includes an item labeled simply lapis voci, the stone of voice. The inventory ends with a note, "Do not speak over it." Scholars have long debated what this meant. A vessel, an oracle, a mistranslation. But paired with Mandaean traditions, it may have been far more literal. The Mandaeans believe some objects, relics from the pre-creation, are not passive. They respond, and not with sound, with change, with intrusion. One chilling account from the 13th century chronicler Benoit de Reims tells of a Templar knight who traveled deep into the Levant and returned with eyes too full. He had been present, it seems, during an interaction with Mandaean elders who showed him the place that cannot be walked into, a cave near the Euphrates, said to house the remains of the voice of the watchers. He returned to Jerusalem, and within weeks had taken a vow of permanent silence. When he died, his body was interred in a sealed crypt, his mouth filled with wax. The Church, of course, condemned all of this. Gnostic heresies, blasphemy, sorcery. But the Templars, always hovering on the edge of orthodoxy, appeared to take the warnings seriously. By the early 1200s, they had ceased all tunneling beneath the Temple Mount. Some believe this had to do with political pressure. Others point to logistics. But among those who trace the deeper line, it's believed the Templars found what the Mandaeans warned them about: a presence, a resonance, something that waits. In later centuries, as the Templar diaspora spread their symbols across Europe in chapels, cathedrals, reliefs, and stone, the figure of the water priest begins to appear. A man holding a mirror, pouring liquid into a broken basin. No Christian story matches this iconography. But in Mandaean rites, this is Yawarziwa, the light-bringer, who seals the gates with living water and weeps for those foolish enough to unseal them. So maybe the Templars listened too late. Maybe they broke something. Or maybe they heard something and chose silence over spread. And so while the Church laughed at the strange Gnostics who refused conversion, the Templars built their final sanctuaries to face away from Jerusalem, not in scorn, but in fear. Because when the Mandaeans say, "Do not wake what sleeps beneath Zion," they are not speaking in metaphor. They are whispering to someone. It was always the most scandalous claim. Not the secret rituals, not the midnight processions or forbidden books. No, what truly captured the imagination of inquisitors, gossip-mongers, and fantasists alike was the charge that the Templars worshipped a head, a human head. Mummified, crowned, sometimes said to speak. At first it sounded like classic medieval hysteria. The Church, in its campaign to destroy the Templars, needed something unholy enough to justify erasing them, and a severed head that would do nicely. It echoed ancient heresies, druidic relics, even pagan idol worship. So for centuries, historians dismissed the accusation as fiction, torture-born confessions, pious exaggeration, and then a casket was found. In 1868, during renovations at a former Templar preceptory in southern France, workers broke open a bricked alcove beneath the chapel floor. Inside was a small stone box, sealed with lead, no markings on the outside. Within it, a skull, not remarkable at first glance. But this one was wrapped in linen soaked with pine resin, and around its base was a band of hammered copper inscribed with 5 unfamiliar glyph symbols that did not correspond to Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. Beneath the skull was a plate carved with one phrase in rough, uneven Latin: caput rediturum est. The head shall return. It was dismissed as a hoax. Convenient. Eerie. Probably just a local noble buried in odd ceremony. But scholars who examined the skull noted something strange. The bone structure was atypical. High cheekbones, elongated occipital ridge, and most disturbingly, the lower mandible had been removed long before burial. Not broken, extracted. And here's where it gets stranger. Across multiple inquisitorial transcripts from 1307-1309, Templar knights confess under duress to revering a head they call Baphomet. Most modern associations with that name come from 19th century occultism, where it's fused with goat imagery and satanic tropes. But the original confessions describe something else: a face. Sometimes male, sometimes female. A head with eyes that see through men. Some said it could speak, others that it instructed. One knight, Bertrand de la Chapelle, claimed the head taught them the names beneath names. Another, under interrogation in Florence, swore that when the head was revealed, time bent. These sound like ravings, and likely were. but the consistency of the claims across geography, language, and rank is notable. Dozens of knights from different preceptories describe the same object, often in near-identical terms. If it was invented, it was a remarkably well-coordinated fiction. If it wasn't, what was it? Theories abound. Some say it was a relic of John the Baptist, whose beheading made him the most iconic holy head in Christian memory. The knights revered him, and Mandean tradition, as we've seen, links him to star knowledge and hidden truth. But the skull in France bore no signs of Semitic origin. Its morphology was ambiguous. Another theory claims the head was symbolic, not human at all, but an abstract representation of divine wisdom like the Sephirot in Kabbalistic thought. In this reading, the Templars didn't worship a skull, but a head of invisible knowledge encoded in ritual, not bone. But a lesser-known theory, quietly passed between esoteric circles, suggests something far more unsettling: that the head was alive. Not in the biological sense, but as a transmitter. A fragment of whatever consciousness the Templars contacted beneath the Temple Mount, the fifth pillar, the speaking stone, the silent gate, condensed into a physical form that could carry its signal across distances. A psychic node, a mouthpiece. One fragment from a Templar codex found in Portugal refers to the voice without breath, sealed in bone. It also includes a diagram, a skull encircled by radiating lines, each marked with planetary symbols. Beside it, the phrase "Custos Veritatis," keeper of the truth. Call back to the earlier chapter on initiations. Remember Arnaud de Villiers' testimony of the wall that spoke without writing, of the initiation chamber, where meaning moved like breath across stone. The idea of unspoken speech recurs again and again. The head, whether literal or symbolic, may have functioned the same way. Not a relic, a receiver. So why did they guard it? Perhaps because it still worked. In the final days before the Templar arrests, several key members were reported to have fled with objects of weight, but not gold. A ship left La Rochelle under cover of darkness, never to be seen again. It carried no manifest, but legends say it bore 3 men and 1 sealed casket. If that story is true, then the head, the original head, is still out there. And if it really did speak, what did it say? Or more chillingly, what will it say when the time is right? It was hidden between the pages of a hymnal. At first, the archivist thought it was a misfile, a parchment wedged too tightly between folios of Bernard of Clairvaux's collected sermons. But it wasn't a sermon. It was older, thinner. The ink had bled in places, and the hand was cramped, rushed, almost panicked. It bore no seal, no date, only a signature, Hugo, and it began with a strange phrase: "You must not let them read it aloud." The letter was addressed to Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot, who became the Templars' most powerful advocate in the early 12th century. It was Bernard who wrote in praise of the new knighthood, giving theological legitimacy to their mission. Bernard who persuaded the Pope to approve their order. Bernard who set them on the road to becoming the wealthiest, most feared brotherhood in Christendom. But this letter didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like a warning. The tone was personal, urgent, almost pleading. The writer refers to what we found beneath the second chamber and says it is not what we thought, and more than what we feared. He speaks of a script with no end of a mouth sealed in metal, and most disturbingly, the words of the gate. No one knows what that last phrase means. It appears nowhere else in known Templar texts. But scholars who've studied the letter agree it's not metaphor. The language is too specific, too direct. The letter then urges Bernard to safeguard the words of the gate and warns that even reading them reshapes the path. That phrase "reshapes the path" is repeated 3 times in increasingly erratic handwriting, as if the author was spiraling. The final line is a single sentence underlined, "Say nothing. Burn this. And tell no one of the mirror." The letter was never burned. If the signature Hugo is authentic and handwriting analysis suggests it is, then the author was Hugues de Payens himself, the first Grand Master of the Templars. And if that's true, then this is the only surviving document in which he speaks plainly, without ecclesiastical filters or coded language. And what he says is terrifying. So what did Bernard do? Historians have long portrayed him as a visionary, a mystic, a reformer. But he was also practical, political, and very, very quiet about certain things. After this period of correspondence, his tone toward the Templars shifted, subtly. He continued to support them publicly, but he became more distant. Letters that once brimmed with paternal warmth became cool and formal. He stopped attending their chapters in person, and in one private homily, found only in a marginal note by a student scribe, he referred to the knights who walk in places not made by men whose eyes are too full of fire. It's easy to chalk that up to metaphor, but when paired with the letter, it takes on a different hue. Call back to earlier threads: the fifth pillar, the language beneath silence, the Templars' sudden cessation of digging beneath the Temple Mount. All of these align in time with the period shortly before this letter was written. It suggests that something was found, something interpreted or misinterpreted, that shook the very foundation of the order. And Bernard, the man who helped build that foundation, may have been warned, too late. There is one more twist. In a Cistercian manuscript from 1151, a diagram appears: a circular seal with 12 petals inscribed with phrases in Latin and Hebrew. At its center is a phrase written in Bernard's own hand: clavis est sermo. The key is the word. That phrase may seem innocuous until you realize that in the mysterious copper scroll and its supposed Templar derivatives, certain phrases repeat across listings of buried knowledge. Among them, "Speak not the key unless the path is made." So perhaps Bernard did more than stay silent. Perhaps he helped conceal. A theory gaining traction among Templar historians suggests that Bernard was entrusted with something: a transcription, a symbol, a partial decoding of the words of the gate, and that he placed it not in the hands of popes or kings, but deep within monastic labyrinths, cloaked in liturgy and prayer. And if that's true, the letter was only the beginning. The true record may lie in Cistercian chant, in apocryphal psalms, in the strange architectural alignments of Bernard's abbeys, all designed not to contain the secret, but to delay its discovery. So when the Templars fled, when their ships disappeared into mist, and their vaults stood empty, perhaps it wasn't because they failed. Perhaps they succeeded. They delivered the key. To a man of God who understood that some doors, even sacred ones, are better left closed. Jerusalem was lost, not just metaphorically, but literally, brutally, and for good. When the city fell again to Muslim control in 1187 after the Battle of Hattin, the Templars were pushed out of their spiritual epicenter. They would never fully return. And yet something strange happened in the decades that followed. The order didn't collapse. It flourished. It grew richer, more structured, and far more secretive. But most of all, it moved west. Portugal was not an obvious choice. It was still a borderland barely carved from Moorish control, a young Christian kingdom clawing its way through the final phase of the Reconquista. And yet, in the early 12th century, even before the full loss of Jerusalem, the Templars began pouring resources into it: land grants, fortresses, naval assets. Some of their oldest European commanderies sprang up not in Rome or Paris, but in Tomar. Why the standard answer is strategic, a safe haven, a foothold against Islam, a supportive monarchy. But dig deeper, and the rationale becomes far more deliberate, almost prophetic. Let's rewind to a rarely discussed charter dated 1159, signed by King Afonso III of Portugal. In it, he grants the Templars vast tracts of land in exchange for protection of the Holy Way, and this is the curious part, custodianship of the Western Gate. That phrase appears nowhere else in medieval Portuguese law. But in certain Templar manuscripts, the Temple Mount is called Porta Orientalis, the Eastern Gate. So if Jerusalem was the Eastern Gate, what was the Western one? Some believe the Templars were looking to replicate what they had found or uncovered beneath Solomon's Temple. That after the collapse of the tunnels, the death of the initiates, and the growing whispers from groups like the Mandaeans, they realized the original site was no longer safe. The seal had cracked. The veil had thinned. And so the logic of preservation dictated a pivot, a mirror site, a second node. Portugal was ideal, geographically removed, politically isolated, and perhaps most importantly, aligned with the setting sun. In 1160, construction began on the Convent of Christ in Tomar, the Templar stronghold that would become the crown jewel of their western expansion. Its architectural core, a round church modeled after the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. But this was no mere homage. Its dimensions mirror the original with eerie precision. Column placement, dome, curvature, ambulatory width all line up within inches of the structure the Templars once called home. A copy, or more disturbingly, a key. Some architectural historians have noted that the inner columns of Tomar's round church are decorated not with typical Christian iconography, but with zodiacal signs, alchemical symbols, and spiraling vegetal patterns more commonly found in Babylonian or Nabatean art. It is a hybrid space, Christian in name, but something else in design. Something older. A chilling callback, recall the symbol found in the 1974 excavation near the Temple Mount the Eye inside the triangle. That exact emblem appears carved into the keystone of the Tomar chapter house, hidden from ground view, visible only when light strikes the stone at a certain angle near solstice. This was not careless masonry. This was encoded architecture. And what of the order's structure? After Jerusalem, the Templars became less martial, more administrative. They built banks. They organized trade. But beneath this evolution lay a more secretive transformation. Their rituals became more encrypted. Access to inner rites was restricted. And many of their most powerful figures, like the enigmatic Gualdim Pais, who oversaw Tomar, rarely left Portugal. A document found in the ruins of a Templar commandery in Castile, written in cipher, makes a bold claim: the light cannot be sealed again, but it can be redirected. The phrase appears beneath a crude map of the Mediterranean, with an arrow pointing west, then north, toward Iberia, toward Scotland, toward, as later legends would have it, the ends of the earth. There's also a navigational component. The Templars began investing heavily in shipbuilding, an odd choice for a land-bound order. In the 13th century, they constructed dry docks in La Rochelle and Lisbon, and their vessels were seen along the coasts of Cornwall, Brittany, and the Azores. The implication is clear: they were preparing for movement. Secrecy. Escape, yes, but also transport. And what precisely were they transporting? That brings us back to the head in the casket. The unspeakable cargo noted in maritime logs. The whispered prophecies of voices sealed in bone or stone or word. If the Templars had preserved not just an object, but a force, a resonance, a script, a sealed knowledge they would have needed to move it far from the eyes of inquisitors and kings. Portugal offered protection. It also offered obscurity. The final twist. When the order was disbanded in 1312, its remnants in most of Europe were hunted, jailed, or killed. But in Portugal, the crown simply renamed them. They became the Order of Christ, same properties, same personnel, same symbols, different name, protected by royal decree. And just over a century later, the ships that would launch the Age of Exploration caravels, carrying the cross of the Order of Christ on their sails, departed from Tomar-controlled ports, heading west. Not for gold, not for spice, but perhaps to trace the arc of something buried, to find the next gate, or to hide the first one more thoroughly. At the heart of Tamar's oldest library, a circular room beneath the convent's round church, sealed off from public view for centuries, lies a peculiar manuscript. Bound in goatskin and written in an angular Latin script, it bears no author's name and no formal title. On its cracked first page is only a symbol, a throne half submerged in waves encircled by stars. Its pages tell a strange tale, not of battles, saints, or relics, but of a king unnamed, eternal, bound beneath the earth by sacred vows, who would rise again when the Tower of the East sinks beneath the weight of untruth. This was the so-called prophecy of the sunken throne, a piece once dismissed by scholars as allegorical Templar mysticism. Until someone noticed a curious pattern, versions of this prophecy exist in multiple Templar strongholds, in Portugal, France, even in a crypt beneath a church in modern-day Syria, and each version contains a slightly different variation of the same central verse. The West will carry the burden, the stone will speak again, and the sunken throne shall rise when all else is dust. What was this prophecy referring to? Was it metaphorical? Or was it like the Templars' double rider seal, a layered symbol, humble on the surface, encoded underneath? Let's return to what we know. After the Templars left Jerusalem, they restructured their hierarchy, their architecture, and most notably, their philosophy. Hidden doctrines like the fifth pillar or the builder's tongue emerged more visibly in their later Western outposts. The sunken throne prophecy seems to draw from this same esoteric lexicon, a blending of apocalyptic mysticism, ancient construction rites, and proto-messianic myth. One clue emerges from the writings of Arnaud de Torroja, the ninth Grand Master of the Order. In a surviving letter written to a monastic ally in Provence, he describes a dream that haunted him for years, a throne of stone beneath an ocean of sand. Voices in a tongue I did not know, speaking of gates and trials, and the light that must not rise too soon. This dream was recounted in tandem with a peculiar phrase he claimed to have read in an old scroll stored at Tamar, a phrase that translates roughly as, "The king sleeps beneath the capstone, veiled in breathless silence." Is it possible that the throne was not just a metaphor for divine right or sacred kingship, but an actual location, a chamber, a sarcophagus, a sealed presence, perhaps even connected to the earlier tale of the Mandaeans who warned of a buried force never to be opened? There's more. In 1917, during restoration work on the Tomar convent, workers discovered a hidden spiral staircase behind the sacristy wall. It led down to a flooded chamber filled with fragmented stonework pillars, pedestals, and what appeared to be the remnants of a collapsed altar. Carved into the largest surviving slab was a throne flanked by two lions, and beneath it, faintly visible in worn Latin, the king waits. Some dismissed the imagery as purely biblical. Others noted that the throne motif closely resembled Assyrian and Phoenician funerary iconography. It was out of place, too ancient, too Eastern for a Templar chapel in rural Portugal. But the implications were ignored in the chaos of the Great War, and the chamber was quietly sealed again. It remains inaccessible to this day. What if the prophecy was literal? What if in their underground diggings beneath Solomon's temple, the Templars had uncovered not a weapon, not the Ark, not gold, but a being. A preserved priest-king from a forgotten epoch, encased in a ritual tomb encoded with symbols meant not to glorify, but to contain several obscure texts in Templar holdings refer cryptically to the sleeper, or he who stirs beneath. Some link this to the Islamic concept of the Mahdi or the Christian idea of the Second Coming. But none speak with certainty. It is always fear, always awe. The sunken throne prophecy then may not be a call to action, but a warning that what lies beneath must remain beneath. That knowledge, like stone, must bear weight, pressure, silence. Now recall the line, "The stone will speak again." This phrase also appeared in a letter we examined earlier, sent to Bernard of Clairvaux. Its phrasing was nearly identical, and Bernard, in his final years, grew deeply wary of the Templars' increasing secrecy. In a lost sermon later reconstructed from fragments, he lamented a thirst for hidden truths that blinds the wise and opens ancient doors better left shut. What were those doors? The symbolic door, the gate of the temple, may have had a counterpart. A western gate, as mentioned in the Portuguese charter. If so, and if the prophecy is to be believed, that gate leads to something buried. A king, a force, a throne. And thrones, historically speaking, do not rise gently. There is perhaps one final detail to consider. In a private notebook kept by 18th-century Jesuit scholar Alexandre de Faria, a man obsessed with Templar esoterica, there's a brief entry written in shaky hand, Tomar. Beneath the old well. The eye watches. The throne breathes. The throne breathes. Not a metaphor. A breath. As if something was waiting. Not dead. Not quite, just sleeping. And that, perhaps, is the core of the Templar prophecy. Not that something will happen, but that something must not. Because if it does, there may be no one left to understand what it means. The stonemasons of the Middle Ages were not merely craftsmen. They were symbologists, storytellers, and in some cases, subtle revolutionaries. As the Templars dispersed from the Holy Land and their focus shifted westward, their architecture evolved. The Romanesque solidity of early chapels gave way to the soaring elegance of Gothic cathedrals. But within that evolution lay something far more deliberate than aesthetic ambition. They were embedding messages into the very stone. In the vaulted ceiling of the Temple Church in London, a peculiar pattern of ribbing appears, unlike any other in contemporary English design. Viewed from directly below, the lines converge into a hidden symbol, a star nested within a keyhole. Most visitors never look up. Fewer still interpret the shape as a map, but some do. Some believe it corresponds to a chamber once buried beneath the Temple Mount, a chamber described in certain Crusader-era documents as the Vault of Silence. Now cross the channel to Chartres Cathedral in France. Tucked beneath the choir is a crypt older than the church itself. The walls are lined with carvings that defy simple classification. A man with two faces, a serpent devouring a sun, a throne with no figure seated upon it. Each symbol appears without caption, as if meant only for those who already knew their meaning. The floor above bears the famed labyrinth, a pattern many interpret as a pilgrim's path. But what if it's something else entirely? A guide, a rite, a warning. In Toledo, Spain, the Iglesia de San Román, a modest structure compared to grander Gothic cathedrals, holds a bell tower with narrow spiral stairs. Along its interior stonework, etched faintly into mortar, is a phrase repeated in Latin Arabic, and a third language that scholars struggle to identify. The throne sleeps in the circle of stars. The same phrase appears reversed and half erased in a side chapel of Tamar's round church. Coincidence is a lovely word for people who dislike patterns. What we're seeing is not isolated artistry. It's a network, a methodical act of encoded transmission. Each building a vessel, each stone a syllable. And if that sounds grandiose, consider the effort it would take to maintain secrecy across centuries. Spoken words vanish, parchments decay. But stone persists. Stone is patient. One architectural historian, while cataloging anomalies in Rosslyn Chapel, found a set of carvings on the underside of a beam only visible when lying flat on the chapel floor. The figures depict a king surrounded by what appear to be planets, each connected by lines. In the king's hand, a broken sword. Beneath his feet, a crack in the earth. The image echoes descriptions found in earlier sections of a prophecy, a sealed force and a fracture beneath Zion. Yet Rosslyn was built in the 15th century, long after the official end of the Templars. And yet, the imagery endures. This brings us to the concept of living stone. In esoteric Templar doctrine hinted at in writings attributed to Grand Master de Molay, stone was not merely material. It was memory. To encode the breath into the pillar was to mark it with meaning. Not visible, not legible, but resonant. Waiting. The suggestion is almost maddening, that our world is surrounded by architecture whispering secrets we've forgotten how to hear. The churches, cathedrals, even ancient castles carry forward not dogma, but a warning. And these warnings always seem to revolve around one concept: return. The prophecy of the sunken throne, the buried king, the gate beneath the temple. Each implies not just danger, but recurrence. Something that once was, maybe again. And those who know how to read the signs may be able to prepare. So what were the signs? At Lincoln Cathedral in the northeast cloister, a stained glass window depicts a crowned figure kneeling before a closed gate. Above the gate, the phrase, "Not yet." No record exists of who commissioned this panel. It doesn't match the rest of the cathedral's iconography. But local legend claims it appeared during a late 14th century renovation, overseen, as it happens, by a group of excommunicated monks who claimed descent from a suppressed Templar order. Elsewhere in the church of San Bevignate in Perugia, a Templar site rarely visited today, the frescoes display a peculiar scene: armored knights lowering a stone slab over a golden circle. Their faces are turned away. Above them, an angel not blessing but turning its back. One might argue these are just coincidences, artistic flourishes, symbolic redundancies. But when the same motifs appear in Portugal, France, Spain, England, Italy, one begins to wonder. What if they weren't left behind as mere homage, but as placeholders? Anchors ensuring that when the time came, the message could be reconstructed. That across the map of Europe, someone someday might draw the lines and understand the shape they formed. And that shape might point back to where it all began. Not Jerusalem, not Rome, but beneath a forgotten slab in a temple older than both. Now remember the phrase carved into the stone beneath Tomar the king waits. Combine it with the image in Rosslyn, the phrase in Toledo, the symbol in London. What do we get? A story, hidden in plain sight. A puzzle passed through cathedrals, whispered in stone. And if we read it correctly, it tells us this: the Templars found something, buried it again, and left behind a map written in silence. All we had to do was listen. You're standing at the edge of a long, dark corridor. Every stone behind you bears a mark, a whisper, a glyph. Some of them cracked, some too smooth. But taken together, they no longer form a jumble of disconnected anomalies. They form a trail. And now that trail leads to one final door and the question it guards. What exactly did the Templars find beneath Solomon's temple, and why were they so desperate to hide it? Let's step through. First, a reckoning. They did not find gold, nor the Ark, nor a divine relic granting supernatural powers. Those were decoys, legends seeded into rumor to misdirect prying eyes. What they discovered was far more dangerous than treasure. It was a knowledge system, a coded ancient framework, possibly pre-Abrahamic, detailing not only metaphysics, but cycles, patterns of collapse and rebirth, warnings, a doctrine that if made public would unravel the legitimacy of both crown and church. Several fragments hint at this. The lost parchment described in early French Templar chronicles, the one said to contain a mirror of the age to come, speaks not of enemies or empires, but of eras, of recurring fractures in human civilization, each marked by a breach beneath a sacred foundation. One line often dismissed as poetic metaphor stands out in hindsight, and when the stone cracks again, the fire will not be quenched by water nor by blood. This language echoes another source, the fifth pillar doctrine recovered in Provençal archives. In that strange manuscript, the pillar is not structural, but temporal, a moment in time buried deep beneath Zion. The doctrine doesn't predict apocalypse, but a rupture, a rending of the veil that separates worlds. The so-called prophecy isn't about destruction, it's about revelation, about what emerges from beneath when humanity becomes blind to its own foundations. Now revisit the image carved at Rosslyn, the crowned figure among celestial spheres. The planets are not merely artistic embellishment. They align with a rare conjunction occurring approximately every 860 years. The last such occurrence around the time of the First Crusade. The next close enough to stir discomfort. The Rosslyn beam may not depict a prophecy. It may record a schedule. Across every clue, the seal of Hugues de Payon, the initiation rituals, the demon-guarded pillars, runs the same subtle current. Duality, surface and depth, outer mission and inner knowledge. And the Templars, ever the bridge between soldier and monk, seem designed to hold both. Even the infamous head found in later Templar inquisitions, long thought to be a heretical idol, takes on new context. What if it was not a god, but a teacher, a preserved remnant of an earlier priesthood, human or otherwise, passing on the instructions for navigating the Great Return? Several Mandaean legends hint at this, that a being of great age sealed beneath the temple must not be awoken before the stars recall his name. They never specify what happens if he is. The architectural clues, the scattered inscriptions, the persistent legends, all of it begins to resolve into a singular motif. A buried king, a sunken throne, a gate waiting to open. This is not the language of fairy tale. This is continuity. A narrative held in sacred custodianship by a brotherhood who realized too late that revealing it might end their order and possibly the world as it was. And so they hid it. Beneath floors, within cathedrals, in the vaults of forgotten abbeys. They whispered it to those who passed their tests. They built maps not on parchment, but into the very bones of Christendom. But why keep it alive at all? Because the prophecy is not merely a warning, it is a charge, a responsibility. Someone in some future age must know what to do when the fracture comes again. Someone must stand at the edge of the stone and decide open or seal. And perhaps that's why the trail persists. Why even in the age of satellites and skyscrapers, the cathedrals still hum, the tunnels still breathe, and certain old stones still warm beneath the moonlight. Because the Templars believed the gate would open again. And they believed someone, maybe not them, maybe not us, but someone must be ready. So this is the shape that emerges from the dust and echoes. They found a buried doctrine of time. They saw its next return. They built a legacy to outlast erasure, and in the silence beneath the temple they buried not just knowledge, but a key. The stars are quieter now. Centuries have passed since the last chisel struck the ancient stone beneath the temple mount, since the final torch was snuffed in those subterranean corridors, since the last Templar gazed upward through layers of dust, time, and silence and whispered a vow no one else heard. And yet, you're still here, still listening, still wondering if maybe, just maybe, all of this was never about the past, but the rhythm beneath it. Because when you look back through each cathedral carved with unreadable glyphs, through every Templar seal and fractured scroll, through the faces of stone kings buried with eyes open, it doesn't feel like the end of a story. It feels like the deep inhale before something returns. The prophecy wasn't a threat. Not really. It was a mirror. A mirror polished in secret, held in trembling hands, and finally tucked away not to be destroyed, but preserved. Awaited. The Templars weren't guarding gold. They were guarding time. A moment, a convergence, a recurrence, a quiet crack in the foundation when history repeats but deeper. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't afraid of what they found. They were afraid of when it would come again. So here you are on the edge of the silence, the stars above the stone below, and somewhere between them, both the last breath of a brotherhood still lingers faint, soft, like dust. Perhaps the prophecy is still buried, or perhaps it was never in the ground. Perhaps it's waiting behind your eyelids, in dreams, in instincts, in the feeling that something ancient is stirring again. Not in fire, not in war, but in knowing. A knowing passed through carved beams, cathedral light, and the humming hush of things too old to forget. So tonight, rest gently, not in fear, but in watchfulness. Because someday when the stone cracks again, you'll remember where the path begins. And this time, you'll know which way to walk.